Merry meet, my fellow bookish witches. Welcome to Witchy Reads, a place where we talk about books and other bookish things. About a month ago, actually I would say probably a little less than a month ago, I started seeing an increase in online chatter about trigger warnings, specifically trigger warnings in books. Within this discourse, a few questions were being asked of the community. Should including trigger warnings be the norm? Are authors being forced to include them? Shouldn't readers be responsible for what they choose to read? Do book blurbs give enough of a warning for the content within the book? Are readers just whiny, fragile babies that need to be coddled by the books they purchase and choose to consume? As a reader and reviewer, I have some thoughts on this arguably hot topic. So, let's talk about trigger warnings. A trigger warning is a statement at the start of a piece of media. Think books, videos, television, that alerts the audience that the entertainment they are about to consume contains potentially distressing material, primarily used to alert people of content that may cause distressing psychological or physiological reactions, especially in people who have previously experienced a related trauma. In novels, trigger warnings can be presented to readers in different ways. One of the most common ways to do this is to simply list the most common triggers within the book on a separate page, either towards the beginning or at the end of the novel. Something like this or this. I think readers and authors are aware of what trigger warnings are, but I'm starting to get the distinct impression that authors in particular are, at best, not aware of why they are used, or at worst, do know and are actively choosing to be antagonistic to their readers. Trigger warnings are a simple and kind way for authors to bridge the gap of understanding and care between their novel's subject matter and the readers of their books. So while I don't personally require trigger warnings to read books and enjoy them, I tend to look more favorably on authors who show that level of care for their readers. It's just a kind of emotional intelligence that I think we should all have as humans. But based on what I saw on Twitter this past month, clearly this is something that many authors are lacking. This discourse about trigger warnings isn't anything new in the literary community. This isn't coming out of left field or out of the void. This is a discussion that makes the rounds regularly in the community. It just so happened to be a current topic of the week. The wheel of literary drama will continue to turn. Most of what I encountered online was different variations of this question. Essentially, an author asking other authors to give their honest opinions on trigger warnings. If they believe in them, use them, and why. Call me crazy, but I feel like if you genuinely wanted to understand the importance of trigger warnings, you should be asking the people who purchase and read the books. Your readers. While I responded to some of these threads with essentially the same response of, hey, adding trigger warnings is a kindness, the reason this particular thread irked me is that it was clearly asked in bad faith and was set up to be like one big author circle jerk, where they could essentially belittle readers who use and want trigger warnings in the books they read. To me, it was pretty clear that this was just a way to reaffirm how they already felt about trigger warnings without wanting to actively hear from readers that benefit from them. I feel it is my place as a reader and reviewer to want to have a genuine conversation about trigger warnings by addressing the most common arguments. I'm just going to go ahead and put a trigger warning on my screen right now for the topics of discussion that are likely to come up as I go through this thread. Let's start with the tweet that posed the original question regarding trigger warnings. warnings. Let's discuss trigger warnings in books. How would an author know what your triggers are? Is it violence, rape, romance, parents, lost friends, alcohol, etc., 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 etc.? An author would need a whole 100,000-page book just covering them before the book was read. No one can be responsible for other people's triggers. It is impossible. First of all, as I mentioned, this question was not posed in good faith. And retroactively looking back on the many threads I saw this last month that asked similar questions, I'm thinking none of them really were, because they were all asked directly to the same audience. Authors. To me, that just screams treacherous. This person in particular had zero interest in actively listening to readers who not only utilize, but benefit from trigger warnings, as made evident by the many people in this thread who answered his question, which boils down to knowing what common triggers to include in your novel that cover the largest demographic of your readership. This author didn't want a genuine answer. He wanted to make fun of people who find trigger warnings helpful. You not only see it, but you feel it in the repeated copy-paste responses he gives to each of the people who gave him a genuine answer. Responding in this particular way confirmed for me that this question was posed in bad faith. And here comes another hot take from me as a reader. I agree with what was given to him as an answer by a lot of these people because they answered his question earnestly and correctly. We are not asking for authors to know triggers. We are asking people to put common warnings for common triggers. Simply saying a book contains adult situations like rape, murder, etc. is not the worst thing in the world. I don't expect others to know what triggers me. This response right here, I think, makes common sense in regards to knowing which trigger warnings can and should be included for a story. Readers don't expect you to list every trigger they have. We know that's ridiculous. But as a society, we have determined certain things that are especially heinous, that tend to trigger large swaths of the populace, such as murder, self-harm, suicide, sexual assault, rape, child abuse, domestic abuse, substance abuse, and eating disorders. This author responds to every person with some variation of this answer, that by only listing specific trigger warnings, that would mean that certain triggers are more important than others. Yes, that's exactly what we are saying when it comes to triggers in media, books, TV, and film. I would say the common sense basis for this comes from the film rating system, which was created in 1968. To act like this isn't just common knowledge at this point is a weird hill to die on. Of course, you can't cover every known trigger, but we all know there are common ones, some of which you listed in one post, etc. You could at least put major triggers as warning on the page or in the description of the book. Don't make excuses. So not only is the question he posed very unserious, but it's clear by how he worded it that he is aware of those common triggers. He's just choosing to be asinine. There are some obvious ones that can be included just as they do for movies. You can't cover everyone's individual triggers, of course, nor should you have to. But the larger ones and more common ones, such as sexual assault, should be listed. And then, of course, he goes on to respond, if you include some and not others, you are declaring that one person's triggers as more important than another's. No, you're acknowledging that there are common ones backed up by data and statistics that movies/TV shows provide warnings for all the time, sexual violence, etc. But also acknowledging you're not going to be able to predict more obscure and less common ones. Readers do not expect, nor do we demand, that every trigger be listed. That would be insane. And I know that some authors have attempted to do this, resulting in pages of triggers that ultimately are unnecessary. I'd like to think that when this happens, this is done because the author's heart is in the right place. They just went a little overboard. Or it's very likely that they were told to do so by their publisher. Or They are just trolling readers. And usually the authors that employ that last reasoning are part of a specific genre. But you are covering less than 0.1% of triggers, 0.1% of all triggers. But most people are triggered by the same few things, so you'd still be covering most people who get triggered. If you include some and not others, you are declaring that one person's triggers as more important than another's. And I love this response to that response. If there's 500 readers who are triggered by sexual assault and one reader that's triggered by the mention of clowns, then it's fair to say one takes priority over the other. Absolutely. I think this response encapsulates everything. It clearly states that there are common triggers, that the poster knows this. And yes, based on the statistics of what triggers the majority of humans, some triggers should take priority when providing them for a book. This really isn't complicated. Readers are not demanding long lists of every trigger. They are just asking for some semblance of empathy from authors. It's not like we're asking them to tag everything that happens. There are lots of things that go without saying, but sexual assault and self-harm and violence against children should come with a trigger warning, no matter the genre, in my opinion. There are maybe 10 major trigger warnings most people are advocating people label their books with. Anything else is just courtesy on the author's part. You don't necessarily have to include a detailed list. Precisely. But of course, as with every discussion, there were those who agreed with him. And the hard truth is, most of them were also authors, not responsible for another's triggers. The last thing on an author's mind should be others' sensibilities that would trigger them. The responsibility is down to the reader and what to expect from the different genres and make their choice accordingly. In that regards, it's no different than film. Except film has a rating system. Like, that's what it's there for. Not only that, but especially on television, they have the rating system and then include what to expect in the program you're about to view, such as sexual violence, death. I've seen it listed on the TV. That is what we are asking for. It's the exact same thing. Do not use film as a comparison if you are not willing to do the exact same thing that they do for film and television. It's the same thing. The gall to sit there and say that the responsibility of the content within the book is on the readers is baffling to me. Authors are responsible for the content in their books. They are the ones most likely to know the content. They wrote it, after all. And if you're intentionally not warning readers, you can't be upset if you face backlash for something that can easily be included, especially if readers are spending money on your books. I feel that sways the responsibility further onto the author. Don't you think? My personal opinion is that adults are able to police their own choice of reading material, as they always have, and stop reading if they don't like something. Those who are triggered by everything are probably best off not reading. Really? Really? You want to go there? That's where you want to go. Okay. Trigger warnings are pretty much unnecessary for adults. The blurb tells people what the book is about. Particular authors are renowned for dealing with offensive topics. If you're that nervous about triggers, perhaps reading isn't the pastime for you. Whoa, Nally, lots of authors don't want their books read, do they? At the end of the day, it's a personal choice. That said, I believe most readers are intelligent enough to fully understand what they're getting themselves into for certain genres. Example, grimdark, splatterpunk, etc. Simply do your best. You can't and won't please everyone. This is some manipulative craziness coming from authors, because they are essentially saying if you need trigger warnings, you aren't intelligent enough to guess the content of the book. That's wild to me. Okay. So let's break this down. Obviously, adults are capable of making their own reading choices. We all have preferred genres, tropes, and characters. And yeah, there are genres that are known to have some heavy topics. So if someone has triggers that are known in those genres, chances are they are taking steps to handle consumption of that content if they choose to do so. The problem comes from genres that are not known for certain triggers and have those triggers anyway. Romance, fantasy, young adult, new adult, Regency era. All of those genres are capable of having sexual assault, rape, self-harm, abuse. It is possible in any genre. And the people who are asking for triggers for those kinds of books aren't looking at horror going, oh yeah, I fully expect this to be a nice time. Authors know what scenes they write and what takes place. Exactly. I mean, look at movies. Rated R for strong language, pervasive violence, and brief nudity. Books, trigger warning, sexual assault, language, and domestic abuse. If I have a trigger, I'd want to know whether a book might bother me. That is fair. That is valid. So we've already covered the fact that just because you read certain genres does not prevent you from encountering certain triggers. Triggers can be spread across many genres. But let's say you are into reading horror. You go into it knowing that the subject matter is likely to be dark. It's where these kinds of statements become generalized. There are online sources where people can look up trigger warnings if they wish. If they're worried about the content, then it should be their responsibility to do proper research, not the authors by warning them. If you grab a horror book, be prepared for horrific elements. The genre like horror has layers. No genre is immune from what I'm about to describe, but to simplify things, I think it is easier to use horror. I'm also going to use the simplicity of the film rating system, as that is something most people are familiar with and understand. So let's say we have a horror book. Just because a book is in the horror genre doesn't mean it automatically should be assumed it is rated R. There are horror films that are rated PG-13, and the difference between these two ratings can be huge, especially for triggers. A fan of horror is still a fan if they only enjoy reading PG-13 horror. Authors also have to accept that that doesn't mean that they will be okay with an R-rated horror book. Saying that a book labeled as horror is enough, or that a blurb is enough, is assuming that everyone has the same level of tolerance. That isn't reality. Everyone is different. PG-13 is not R, and vice versa. And the differences between the two can be a huge thing to deal with. There are different levels of violence, gore, if any, plus a host of other triggers that don't have to be common for horror, such as sexual assault. Putting aside everything else, this way of thinking is absolutely a way to gatekeep the genre. Fans of horror don't have to enjoy the most depraved shit the genre can provide to love it. I am a fan of horror. I love horror films, and I've recently started getting more and more into horror novels. But I know for a fact that there are certain things that I still am not comfortable reading. Does that mean I will never read those kinds of books? No, I am working my way up to being comfortable reading those kinds of books. And that is why trigger warnings are important. Also, from what I gather of reading that thread, those online resources are essentially reviews from other reviewers who have read the book. Authors not only don't want to put in the work of simply writing out common triggers of content that they themselves wrote and would be easy for them to do, they are expecting their readers to purchase their book, read their book, and then write reviews with those common triggers for other readers to search for. That is a whole heck of a lot of work that you are putting on your readers, and that to me is not fair, especially when it's something that could easily be done in your book and takes you maybe 2 minutes tops. This society is so screwed up to the point that people think they're entitled to something just because they get offended. I've seen horrific stuff. Not once have I ever asked people to cater to my experiences or feelings about it. I dealt with it in my own way and time. Because dealing with traumatic experiences is on you, not everybody around you, and most certainly not authors. Imagine that you have a food allergy and you go out to a nice Italian restaurant that you've heard great things about. You ask about the ingredients in the dish you would like to order, because presumably the chef would know since they cooked it, and you, the customer, would not, since you are simply wanting to consume it. Imagine after asking that question, you, the customer, are then yelled at, ridiculed, called weak, and are told that you should know what is already in the dish because all Italian restaurants are the same. You asked about this dish because you have an allergy. You could have an allergic reaction. It sounds ridiculous when you put it that way, doesn't it? The only difference is that authors expect you to purchase their meal first. So long as they buy the book before they are triggered, I don't care. That person really said the quiet part out loud, didn't they? While I empathize, I don't feel it is reasonable for me as an author to attempt such a list of warnings. The reader is not captive. If the story appears to be heading into such territory, stop reading. Rarely does anything in a novel occur so very suddenly. I write stories for adults, but if there's something in it something doesn't like, just skip over those parts. This line of thinking is not only wrong, but it can also be seen as somewhat ableist. It's like these people have never heard of audiobooks. Something triggering can definitely sneak up on a reader listening to an audiobook. I listen to audiobooks at a minimum 2 times speed. A shocking scene could absolutely jump scare me while consuming a book that way. I know there are other readers who do the same. Dear audiobook authors and agents, please put trigger warnings on your books. I'd rather not have a panic attack mid-recording next time, thanks. Most people are not going to be happy about a surprise rape scene, especially if the blurb says nothing about it. Both of these are fair requests, and I think they debunk the claim that you have ample warning for triggering scenes and can just stop reading. I also want to say that audiobooks are not the only format in which triggering scenes can appear out of nowhere. It can also absolutely happen in an ebook or physical book. And in fact, it has happened to me. I'm going to tell you about a little book I read a number of years ago called Beast, A Tale of Love and Revenge by Lisa Jensen. It is a young adult fantasy Beauty and the Beast reimagining that I read back in 2018. There were no trigger warnings for this book. Why would there be? It's a fantasy. It's young adult. It's a Beauty and the Beast reimagining. We all know the story of Beauty and the Beast. Nothing should be completely shocking here. And yet, at about the 20% mark, there is a brutal rape scene that had my jaw on the floor. There was no way to know that it was coming. On top of that, it is 2 pages long. 2 pages! Most consensual sex scenes outside of the romance genre don't last longer than a page, let alone 2. This is a well-known love story where the male main character needs to have a 180 character redemption arc. Otherwise, the love story does not work. There is no way to come back from the male main character, the love interest, raping the woman main character. So not only did this scene come so far out of left field, there is no coming back from that. Your story is ruined. I continued to read this book because I truly wanted to see how this was going to fix itself. I really thought, there's no way. In addition to rape, the woman main character is a rape apologist. That's right. That is how they try to make this story work, by having the woman main character be okay with the fact that the male main character raped her. And frankly, yeah, that's really the only way you were going to fix this story. You weren't going to have it make sense to have these two fall in love unless that woman became okay with the fact of what that man did to her. There is also abuse, attempted suicide, and abortion, all in this one fantasy, young adult Beauty and the Beast reimagining. I'll say here, none of this stuff is particularly triggering for me. Not to the point that I wouldn't read a book even if there had been a trigger warning listing these ahead of time. The problem with what occurred is that this book isn't in a known genre to have these kind of triggers, such as people claiming horror is. And because it's a reimagining of a well-known story, readers are completely blindsided by this scene. There is no way to prepare. There is no time to stop reading before you see what is happening. Don't believe me? Just go check out the Goodreads reviews for this book. A lot of readers were angry, not because of the content, but because they were blindsided by it. They weren't ready. That's just it. Most readers don't use trigger warnings to not read a book. They use them to make sure they are in the right headspace to handle the content within the book. By not providing trigger warnings and surprising your readers, you're more likely to piss them off. I know I was irritated. It's 2024. That book, what it did to me, still pisses me off. Your triggers are your responsibility. Agreed. To an extent, but authors are responsible for the content they put in their books. Trigger warnings can help readers make a more informed choice that these authors seem to think they need to make organically. I say it's hard to make an informed decision when you don't have all the information. Millions of books written with no concern for triggers, and authors didn't care if the reviews were good or bad. People need to get over themselves. If they come to a point that bothers them, they have the choice to stop reading. Trigger warnings are not a new thing. They can be traced back to the early 1960s when the medical world was just learning about PTSD. Over time, progress has been made, and in addition to adding them to film and television, we have now started to add them to books. I do feel like they serve a purpose and are necessary. This is just a weak argument in the vein of, this broken thing we've been doing for years works just fine, and I see no need to improve upon it, except for the fact that it doesn't work just fine. There are readers who need trigger warnings and who use them. To grow as a society, things need to change. Adding trigger warnings is one of those things that I think helps the people who use them and can be easily ignored by everyone else. The change is literally that minor, and yet authors want to assume that this is the most egregious thing that readers can ask of them. Despite horribly bad takes such as this, trigger warnings are what trigger me. If you can't handle uncomfortable topics, go cover yourself in bubble wrap and don't read words. There are people, authors, that have genuine concerns about how best to present trigger warnings and are willing to hear readers out. For the most part. The main concern by authors seems to be the fear of spoilers. Reading a book where the author put death of a main character in the trigger warnings. Like, how is that not just a straight up spoiler? Was this a former fanfic? Because that sure sounds like an AO3 main character death warning, lol. Haha, it's a silly Beauty and the Beast retelling. Clearly, this was not the same Beauty and the Beast reimagining I read. I do think when it comes to readers, they need to understand that just because an author is unsure about adding trigger warnings doesn't necessarily make them a villain. Authors also need to be willing to listen to readers who utilize them. They need to learn how to properly apply trigger warnings so that spoilers don't happen. And I feel like this is something that can be very easily avoided. Saying death or murder isn't necessarily a spoiler, but if you think it is, not all readers are going to see it. Only those that read trigger warnings will. And at that point, spoilers aren't really a concern. We'll soon be left with nothing to write since someone somewhere will be triggered by something. Now, this argument is starting to sound like they think adding trigger warnings is the same as censoring books. That is so far from the truth. We aren't asking you to change what you write. Just give us a heads up. Authors totally have the right to write the story that they want, but readers also have the right to know if the content could be potentially traumatic for them. Another common suggestion that was brought up is that trigger warnings are only acceptable for certain books to make sure certain age demographics don't read something they shouldn't. Warnings belong on K through 12 books, as they may be required reading for minors. If you are okay with some trigger warnings on some books, why is it so outrageous to just have that across the board? Not to mention that no children's book should have any of the common triggers. If they do, that's not a children's book. There is a profound essay on trigger warnings written by Roxane Gay back in 2012. It's called The Illusion of Safety, the Safety of Illusion. I think the criticism she employs in the beginning, explaining why she doesn't see the need for trigger warnings, is a bit harsh. I did value her thoughts regarding the complicated nature of such a debate. Few are willing to consider the possibility that trigger warnings might be ineffective, impractical, and necessary for creating safe spaces all at once. There is a level of responsibility on both sides, and trigger warnings should never be a replacement for actual therapy. To learn how to handle certain triggers, sometimes you just have to face them, but readers should be allowed the time and space to do so on their own time. In the meantime, we can request kindness and grace from authors. There is value in learning, where possible, how to deal with and respond to the triggers that cut you open, the triggers that put you back in terrible places, that remind you of painful history. In Roxane Gay's mind, as an author, trigger warnings do push the idea of censorship because to endorse them would mean writing for them. I disagree with this. Readers are not asking writers or authors to write for our triggers or even the common triggers. We are simply asking that you give us a heads up. This is in no way censorship. As readers, we have every right to not read certain books if they contain that material that triggers us. Towards the end of the essay, though, Roxane Gay gets to what I think should be the main takeaway from this discussion. I do recognize that in some spaces, we have to err on the side of safety, or the illusion thereof. Trigger warnings aren't meant for those of us who don't believe in them, just like the Bible wasn't written for atheists. Trigger warnings are designed for the people who need them, who need that safety. Those of us who do not believe should have little say in the matter. We can neither presume nor judge what others might feel the need to be protected from. Just because you may not see the benefit of trigger warnings, you can easily take a step back and just be kind to those who do. Even if you think taking safety from triggers is an illusion, who are you to tell someone that they can't try to seek some semblance of safety from that? I think readers know better than anyone the benefit of trigger warnings, while also knowing they aren't a cure. It's simply viewed as part of the treatment as long as kindness prevails. I've seen a lot of talk about trigger warnings in books. While they're technically not a necessity and you can't protect what will trigger a reader, I think it's courteous and thoughtful to add them, even if it's just a general one at the start of the book. Yeah, I definitely think we should normalize trigger warnings with all media. As you say, it's a simple courtesy. Same. It's just a nice thing to do for someone else, and it takes a few seconds. Miscarriage is a major trigger for me. This is only disabling when access isn't provided. Now, some of this is trigger warnings. Some of it is recognizing that the world is different for me. Trigger warnings do really nothing in the absence of my therapist because I'm not trying to work through this on my own, just like I don't go to lectures without my hearing aids. Content warnings can be useful because they let me avoid reading a book on a bad day until I'm in a more stable place or something like that. I personally don't have a lot of triggers, and those I do have don't really keep me from enjoying books. I use trigger warnings to know what to expect should I need to prepare or get into the right headspace to ensure I have a good time while reading. I've recently started reading more horror. Part of that is being aware that I will likely get scared or triggered. That doesn't mean, as a reader, I should just assume that sexual assault or rape or any form of abuse will be a part of those books. As a reader and reviewer, those should absolutely be listed as trigger warnings somewhere accessible to readers. An analogy that I like to imagine is you as a reader have agreed to play catch with an author. They pick up a baseball and with no warning, chuck it at your head as hard as they can. You have no way of knowing that the baseball is coming at you. You have no time to react. Now imagine if the author simply yelled, "Catch!" before throwing the baseball. You now know the baseball is coming, and better still, you get to decide to dodge it or catch it. This is what trigger warnings provide for a reader such as myself. I would like to see what is coming at me so I can make the decision if I am going to dodge for now or catch it. My ultimate solution to this issue would be to have authors list all their trigger warnings for each of their books on their website and then direct readers to that website for their books. I truly feel like this is probably one of the best compromises for both authors and readers. It gives readers a database of those triggers if they need them, and it's an easy way for authors to include them without having to include them directly in their book. The biggest fix needs to be having all of us in this wonderful community actively being kind to one another. Kindness costs nothing. In the case of trigger warnings, it serves as the ultimate kindness to readers. I'm going to end this video with one final thread. This one by a different author who used to view trigger warnings as useless, but has come around to a different way of thinking. And I think they do a perfect job of expressing my final feelings on this matter. 10 years ago or thereabouts, when I first encountered the concept of trigger warnings in books, I didn't really think they were necessary or even desirable. I've come to reassess my opinion. Here's why. There are some things in fiction that I don't want to read about. I don't need trigger warnings for any of them, but I have come to understand that we all have different needs, and that some people do need warning about certain kinds of content. I don't need to know why certain scenes or plot lines might be found triggering, nor is it my place to tell anyone how they should feel or what I think they need from my books. If it makes them comfortable to know what's coming, so be it. To me, trigger warnings are like wheelchair ramps. They exist because some people need them. The people who don't can either use them anyway or take the stairs. Their choice. The fact that some people don't take the stairs does not detract in any way from my experience, nor do I hang around the wheelchair ramp mocking those who use it, or telling them how much better it would be for them to be exposed to the climb. For many excellent reasons, that would be a dick move. Likewise, trigger warnings. Many people don't need them. Those who do deserve access to what they need to get them where they want to be, just as wheelchair users deserve access. Concerned about spoilers? Here's an idea. Put the trigger warnings on the copyright page. It's a page most people don't bother with anyway, and if everyone did this, readers would know where to find or avoid the relevant information. Trigger warnings are nothing to do with banning books or censorship. They exist to make reading the book easier and more accessible, just as wheelchair ramps are there to make access easier and more accessible for those who need them. And in a society where literacy is in decline and fewer people want to read for pleasure, making books accessible and fun in whatever way readers need them to be is more important than anything else. So far, I haven't included trigger warnings in my books. From now on, I will. I'm currently updating my website to show content warnings for all of my backlist, and I'm going to insist that my publishers do this for all my books moving on. As authors, we can do this. Will you? If you have any thoughts surrounding this topic, please feel free to express them down in the comments below. I just ask that we please keep it cordial and kind, because in the end, that is what trigger warnings are for. They are meant to be a kindness. This isn't a topic that I think will have a solid solution anytime soon, but a bookish witch can hope. If you enjoy my videos and would like to support my channel, the best way to do that right now is to like this video, subscribe to my channel if you haven't already done so, and share any videos that you particularly like. It really is a huge help, and I greatly appreciate it. Until our next chapter together, merry part and blessed be.